I think we should get the show on the road, and I'd like to start off by just welcoming everyone and good evening on behalf of the Rotary Club of Peninsula Starlight and the Rotary Club for Global Action. Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening for this special opportunity to hear from and have a conversation with Nadine Pemberton. In the audience, we have a wonderful representation from multiple districts, including international attendees. Welcome, all of you. Thank you for making the time difference happen and work for you to be here. We have some past district governors with us tonight. Thank you for your service. And thank you to all of you serving on our district leadership team. And a special welcome and thank you to our current district governor, Mary Bates. Before we get started, I do have a few notes to cover. There will be time for questions after Ms. Pemberton's prepared remarks. So if you have any questions for our guest speaker, we invite you to click on the chat icon at the bottom and put your questions in the chat box. We'll be collecting them there. And until then, all the attendees will be enjoying in listen-only mode. This event will be recorded for the benefit of people who could not be with us tonight. The focus during the presentation of the focus of the camera will be on the speakers, but if you prefer not to be on camera at all, you're welcome to turn your camera off. And if you're going to be moving about or multitasking for other purposes, we do recommend turning your camera off in that instance. And lastly, if you experience any technical difficulties, please email Jonathan Nicholas. Jonathan will provide his email for you here and in the chat box. He'll be monitoring that email throughout the program. Jonathan Nicholas was President Starlight's inaugural president, and he is our Zoom master this evening. He is now assistant governor and the district Zoom coordinator. Could we all take a moment to share our appreciation for Jonathan hosting and facilitating us this evening? So much appreciated. He really makes the magic happen. My name is Laura Curran. I'm the current president of the Rotary Club of Peninsula Starlight. At less than 2 years, we are a young club. We have outside the box thinkers and doers and a membership that is diverse, and about half of them are new to Rotary. We embrace innovation and collaboration. And I have the pleasure to introduce our moderator this evening, Brian Rusch. Brian was one of our Peninsula Starlight's charter members. He is also the founding president of the Rotary Club for Global Action. So Brian is the perfect example of innovating in Rotary. He saw an opportunity with online meeting technology to take the Rotary Club concept to a new level and created the first international e-club. It is recently chartered and is already thriving. In addition to being a Rotary Club president, last year, RI President Holger Knock appointed Brian to the first Rotary International Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, DEI, task force, responsible for putting together a plan to assess the state of DEI in Rotary globally amongst 1.2 million members. In his personal endeavors, Brian has run organizations for both the Archbishop Desmond Tutu and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Taking the knowledge they imparted to him, he created programs for youth to inspire their own explorations of ethics and to reshape conversations on peace, equity, and forgiveness. Brian's a sought-after speaker and regularly consults with nonprofit organizations, governments and corporations, and celebrities to help them strategize how they can best optimize their platforms to be change makers for good. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm Rotary welcome to 21-year Rotarian, Brian Rusch.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I also want to reiterate what Laura said about Jonathan. We could not do any of this if it wasn't for him. So thank you as well, Jonathan. You know, since COVID started, we've been doing the speaker series as a way to introduce high-profile speakers from around the world to speak about topics that we have felt are important to Rotarians around the world. And I'm so excited to welcome tonight's guest. Nadine Pemberton is a lawyer, and she's the managing director of Pemberton Plus Coaching and Consulting, where she uses her expertise in regulation and governance, diversity and inclusion, and as a life leadership and career development coaching. She's been a Rotarian since 2012, and she's the past president of the Westminster International Rotary Club in London, England, as well as the former assistant governor of District 1220, which covers the East Midlands and South Yorkshire in the UK, and District 1130, which is London. Nadine qualified as a lawyer in 2003, and she worked in the UK government bodies for over 16 years in roles that ranged from senior prosecutor to executive director of legal. She has extensive experience in frontline, senior, and executive leadership roles, spanning regulatory, criminal, and civil fields. Throughout her career, Nadine has specialized in strategic organizational development, team change, and transformation, and she has a well-established and proven commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion in all areas of her work. She's a trustee board member and head of the diversity committee for Friends of Dorothy, a UK charity focused on combating social isolation and loneliness in older LGBTQ+ people. In May of last year, Nadine founded the Rotarians Against Racism, a global community of Rotary family, friends, and supporters, all committed to being a voice for peace in this fight against racism. I first had the benefit of meeting Nadine last September when the two of us were appointed to the Rotary International Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force. And really quickly, I'd like to welcome, I know Ugo is with us and Rukmini as well, who are two of the other task force members. I didn't see anybody else, but if you're here with us too, please give us a shout out in the chat so we know you're here and I can say hi. I'm really happy to have all of you guys here. And as Laura mentioned, the task force is responsible for helping us to put together a plan to assess the state of DEI in Rotary and among all of our 1.2 million members. I am so grateful to not just be able to call Nadine a colleague, but also a friend. You know, we've bonded over cheesy Christmas movies and what we're watching on Netflix at any time, and she's constantly sending videos from the beach in St. Lucia where she happens to be avoiding COVID at the moment, and constantly is jealous. And tonight, I am just so completely honored to welcome my friend, Nadine Pemberton.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everybody. It's really good to be here. You know, one of the things that I love about Rotary is the opportunity to talk to different people all around the world. And, you know, right now at 10:30 something PM in St. Lucia, 10:42, I'm quite sure there's no better place to be than on this call with you all. I was so pleased when Brian asked me to come and talk to you. I think it's really important that when we have something to say in Rotary or elsewhere, that we get our voice out there, and we do that. And that's, you know, that's one of the values that I work behind and live behind, is speaking truth. And so I'm just so pleased that I can have this conversation with you all this evening. So the title of my talk tonight is "How can we stand for peace and not stand against racism?" And I recently wrote an article for Rotary in Great Britain and Ireland magazine, and that was essentially the topic. It was about Rotarians against racism. It was about Rotary and what we're doing to stand against racism. And for me, a key tenet of that was, as Rotarians, as Rotary, we're all about peace. That's what we do, okay? And so surely then, standing against racism is inherent in what we should do also. And I really do believe that. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. Thank you, Brian, for the introduction. That tells you something about me, about what I do, but I want to tell you a little bit about me and how I came to found, let's say, the Rotarians Against Racism community and what that means to me in the context of peace and in the context of standing against racism. So you've heard I'm a lawyer. My family come from St. Kitts and Nevis, and my mother moved to England and my grandparents moved to England in the 1950s, came from the beautiful, warm Caribbean island of Nevis to the also, but differently beautiful England, which wasn't quite so warm. And in recent years, I've spoke to my mum about what it was like to move from the Caribbean to England at the age of 9 and start this new life. And one of the things that my mum talked to me about was the racism that they encountered when they came to England. Things like having their names changed to names that were not theirs. My granddad was called Esau. But when he moved to England, people called him Arthur, partly because they didn't want to say what was his actual name. And I know that many people have experienced that, when people don't use the name that you were given, the name that belongs to you, because something else is easier to say. And I'll talk a little bit about microaggressions such as that at a later point. That's one of the things that my mum talks to me about how it felt to be so different and how it felt to be called names based on the colour of her skin. And it makes me then think about my childhood, and I remember the first time I was called the N-word. It's not a word that I use, so that's how I refer to it. And I was 7 years old. I was in school. I remember the person who called me it. I remember the context in the playground. And this young boy, maybe 9 or 10, just walked up to me and called me the N-word. I'd not heard that before. And I remember that feeling that I had, knowing it wasn't a nice word, knowing that was something that was about me because of the colour of my skin. And that hurt inside around that was something that's carried through with me. And it's not just in childhood, you know. I remember the feelings of being different, of feeling other than, of being told that I spoke really well. I've had that many times. Gosh, you speak really well. Oh, are you really a lawyer? I can't quite believe that sort of conversation. I think about the times when I've been called aggressive. Now you might think, well, she's a lawyer, so that's part of the territory. But actually, that's not my personality. And in the times that I've had to question, why is somebody calling me aggressive? Why are they saying that I'm angry when I'm not? I know that it's in those times that I'm being called those things because people are seeing a Black woman, and that's a stereotype that they may have of me. And so in May of last year, and 2020 seems like the year that went on forever for many different reasons, and May 2020 is not that long ago, when I saw part of the video of the murder of George Floyd, when I had seen other things in the news, people being killed, people being treated differently or badly, not just in America, but in different parts of the world, something in me really changed. And I would say that, along with the COVID-19 pandemic, where we have and we continue to see inequalities in healthcare and inequalities in health outcomes for people of colour, for Black people, for Asian people, for people from Indigenous backgrounds, it broke something in me. And I know there'll be people on the call who can really identify with that. And I felt bereft, I felt broken, and I didn't feel at peace at all. And it took me back to a role I had been in where I had suffered racial inequity and I'd suffered racial discrimination and hadn't wanted to name it because it was so painful. And the events of May 2020 really brought that right to the fore of me, and I felt lost and like I'd lost some peace that I had. And so that was a time of grief. But ultimately for me, it was also a time, and I apologize, that's Siri. Let me take the watch off. Technology. That was a time for me when I felt that I really needed to see some change and needed to do something myself. I'm a Rotarian. I've been a Rotarian, as Brian said, since 2012. And so, as I've also said, peace is what we're about, it's what we do. And I was wondering, what can I do to create some peace in myself, but also to bring peace to others, to create a space for Black people, for Asian people, for people from Indigenous backgrounds, people of colour, to not only talk about their experience, and be able to share what their lives were like and what was happening for them, but also for them to be heard and seen by other people. Because I really believe that part of peace is being heard and being believed and having your truth listened to. So I created the Rotarians Against Racism community, knowing that in Rotary we're people of action, and that we are people who want to do something, who want to make a difference, who want to be the change. And so I felt that Rotary was the place to go to for me to do this, to create a safe space, to create a challenging space, but ultimately to create a place where we could really think about racism, anti-racism, and how that's so important for peace. And so that question then, how can we stand for peace and not stand against racism? I've been asking myself for quite some time. When we talk about Rotary within our own Rotary family, we say in Rotary, we refuse to accept conflict as a way of life. We say that Rotary creates environments of peace and that peace is a cornerstone of our mission. And so if part of our mission is to take action to address the underlying causes of conflict, which include discrimination and ethnic tension, which include lack of access to education or unequal distribution of resources, amongst other things, then surely standing against racism and inherently racist systems and structures is also the cornerstone of our mission. I absolutely believe that, and I believe that that's what Rotary is about. If we say in Rotary that as part of our mission for peace, we're looking to save mothers and children, and we want to make high quality healthcare available to vulnerable mothers and children so that they can live longer and grow stronger. We say that we want to expand access to quality care to give mothers and children better futures and better opportunities for a healthy future. Then it's really important to think about our healthcare systems, whether that's in the USA, in North America, whether it's elsewhere in the world, whether it's in the UK, because figures and statistics will tell us that, one example, Black women in the UK are 5 times more likely than white women to die during childbirth. Just, let that figure sink in. 5 times more likely to die during childbirth. That's not peace. Knowing that you're likely to have different health outcomes, that's not a peaceful way to live. We talk in Rotary about fighting disease, and we say that, we know that disease results in misery, pain and poverty for millions of people all over the world. And for us, that's why treating and preventing disease is vital. It's really important. Think about coronavirus, the pandemic that we're still living through. And in England and Wales, Black men are around 2.7 times more likely than white men to die from coronavirus. For Bangladeshi men, the figure is around 2.5 times as likely. And for Pakistani men, nearly twice as likely. And there's a significant increased risk for Black, Asian, and women from other ethnic backgrounds as well. Knowing that when you seek healthcare, that the outcomes for you are likely to be more detrimental than your white counterpart, than your white friend, that doesn't let you sit with peace. That's not peaceful. I was doing some reading around documented racial and ethnic disparities in the US government's country's healthcare as well. And even as long as 35 or so years ago, a government report called the Heckler Report noted that the underrepresentation of Black physicians and poorer access that Black, Asian and ethnic people of colour had to good hospitals was attributed to inequalities in healthcare. A report in 2003 by the National Academies of Science also showed implicit and expressed bias in the treatment of Black patients, segregated healthcare system, systematic discrimination against Black doctors. And studies continue to show that inequality continues, as we know for now, even in how Black patients are treated in terms of their pain. Again, that's not peaceful. That's not peace. And it's so important that we, work against these systematic inequalities, which often come from racial inequity and which are not bound in peace. And so one of the things that I take comfort from is that I know that there are Rotarians around the world working to fight injustice, working to fight racial inequity, and working for peace. But one of the things that I like about, I should say I love about the Rotarians Against Racism community is that people can show up where they are. So nobody is expected to be an expert. People are there to listen and to be educated and to help others learn. People are there to make a mistake, because we all make mistakes. We're none of us perfect. But to learn from those mistakes and to really think about what must it be like for somebody who is not able to live in peace because they're treated differently due to the colour of their skin, because they're racialised, because they're marginalised due to the colour of their skin. And for me, that's what this is really about. It's about learning, it's about listening, and then it's about taking action as we move towards and work towards peace. And certainly for me, racial inequity is not peaceful, and that's why it's so important for us to really stand against racism and fight for peace in this respect. Thank you, Brian.
Sorry, I was trying to find unmute. Thank you so much, Nadine. I mean, that it was really, I've known you for all these months now, and I had never actually heard all that story behind why you started it, and I really appreciated that. So thank you so much for sharing that. I wanted to talk about Rotarians Against Racism because it's a group really where people can come together to have these conversations. But I also feel like many of the people that are joining the group are already on board, right? Like they're in a space where they're ready to have this conversation and they want to. And so I'm curious, what are your ideas for how we initiate this conversation with people who aren't there yet? How do we, either that don't know that it even needs to be had, which is quite honestly the case in many, quite often, or that frankly just don't want to have this conversation because they for whatever reason they just don't feel it's appropriate for Rotary to be getting into.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Brian. So one of the things I did when I was thinking about Rotarians Against Racism was make contact with some Rotarians about Rotarians Against Racism. And I was told by several Rotarians more experienced in Rotary than me, that this was not something that we should be talking about, that this was a political issue. So we couldn't talk about it. And I talked about Black Lives Matter, and I think that was probably the catalyst that made people say, oh, we can't talk about this. Rotary doesn't do politics, okay? And I completely disagree with that. And that's what I said to those particular people. And the reason I disagree with it is this. We talk about poverty, so we feel comfortable to talk about poverty, and it's terrible that people are living in poverty, and we want to do what we can as an organisation to help people out of poverty. And poverty is a political issue. Humanity is a political issue. People not living in peaceful environments, people not being able to go to good schools, not having good healthcare, that's all political. And so it's humanity. It's really about humanity. And so that's what I say to people. Actually, no, this is not about politics. This is about human beings. And so I absolutely disagree with that. But I know that there are lots of Rotarians who might say that and think that. So that's the first thing, because that's what is often said. It's political. We can't talk about it. And so I say, well, actually, it's not political. It's about humanity. It's about peace. And so let's talk about it. And I think what often happens, Brian, what I've experienced, people will say, I understand what you're going through as a Black person. You're talking about, you know, being racially discriminated, etc., because I'm a woman and Rotary is only now just about to have its first female president. So that's something that people will say, and I would say, sexism and racism are different things. They're different isms, and neither of which are good. But let's just have a conversation about race. You know, what are you doing what does your workplace look like? That's a question I often ask people, because I think people can relate more easily to what's happening at work sometimes and can be quite protective of Rotary. What's happening in your workplace? Is your board diverse? Those are questions that we can ask, and people can see often the answer to that. So that's the way that I tend to bring the conversation in. And I also, people often feel some real discomfort, I'd say, when, that's probably the most polite way to put it, when talking about racism.
Right.
And I know that can be really hard. And I use the words white people and Black people or Pakistani people, Indian people, because these are people who we're talking about. And so it tends to be white people who feel the discomfort around having the conversation. But that's not the reason not to have the conversation. Actually, the discomfort is really important. And it's okay to feel it. It's okay to not like what you're hearing. But ultimately, there's work to do underneath. So I'm quite happy to talk to people and let them feel that discomfort. People often come back for a conversation at another point when they start to work through that and think about why that is. My coaching tells me to tell my clients to notice what's happening with them as they're going through something. What are they feeling? And really try to think about that. And I try to use that in spaces where I'm talking about race and racial inequality as well, and in Rotary.
I find, you know, it's interesting because I hear that conversation around the discomfort quite a bit. And, you know, that having that discomfort during the conversation is not really comparable to the discomfort that Black people, that people of different ethnicities have been experiencing all their lives. And so if it's an hour of discomfort to have that conversation, a real true conversation with somebody in order to grow, it's worth it, because nothing really, you know, if it was easy, then we'd be having this conversation all the time, right? So it's
absolutely. And I think that's where, you know, as Rotarians, we're leaders in our communities, we're often leaders in our workplaces. Actually, as leaders, we have a responsibility, I think. We have a responsibility to do different, be different, and to challenge. And that includes challenging ourselves a lot of times as well.
So let me ask you this then, because I think it's so important, especially when we're having this conversation around DEI and Rotary, that we expand our definitions of diversity. And it's interesting because as we're doing this, I actually had this feedback from a club member. As we expand this conversation around diversity, are we losing this conversation around race and specifically around Black Lives Matter? Are we diluting that part of the conversation when we start talking about LGBTQ plus rights or people with disabilities, or, you know, and how do we, you know, have this conversation about diversity, but make sure that race remains a significant focus in that conversation?
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point. So yes, it can get diluted and does get diluted. And I think for me, one of the important things to say is just because I I really believe in anti-racism, doesn't mean that I care less about my LGBTQ plus colleagues or friends. It doesn't mean that I care less about disability rights. You know, what it actually means though is that at particular points in time, my focus is on what's happening in relation to racism and anti-racism. And it's okay to have that focus. It's absolutely fine. It doesn't mean that there is no place for other conversations. It just means that sometimes we need to amplify a particular community, a particular marginalized group, depending on what's happening for that group at the time. And so I think it's really important not to always dilute everything, which is why I say, you know, when I talk about a racist experience and then somebody tells me, oh yeah, I understand that because, you know, I've suffered sexual discrimination, I have to say, I really appreciate that because I've suffered sexist discrimination too. However, this is actually a conversation about race right now. This is a conversation about racism. And interestingly enough, that for me is, you know, a form of microaggression, always, you know, putting aside the race issue and bringing another issue in. That for me is saying, actually, I'm not hearing you, I'm not listening to you, I'm telling you what's important to me, actually not what's important to you at this point.
Well, it's interesting because I wanted to talk about microaggressions. You've described them as a polite pain. And so I was wondering if you could share with us, you know, you shared with the name, which really briefly on the name thing, it's like,
Yeah.
at least in the US, we've all learned how to pronounce Schwarzenegger. We can pronounce anything, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
it's,
Well,
could you share some experiences about microaggressions that you've experienced either in Rotary or in a professional setting?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who don't know, I don't make assumptions about what people do or don't know because we're all at a different stage in our learning and our education. But microaggressions are a way to describe sort of subtle insults and put downs. That's how they were first coined. And it was in relation to Black people, it was in relation to African American people. And for me, the microaggression is, I didn't know about them until a few years ago, Brian. I didn't know the term, okay? And I was on a leadership program for Black, Asian, minority, ethnic people within the National Health Service. And our tutors put this slide up about microaggressions. What's this? And our tutors told us about the things that people say or do. It'll almost feel like somebody's saying something nice. It can almost feel like a compliment, okay? But that's not what it is. And it comes from often a place of discrimination or ignorance. So some examples of microaggressions that I've experienced, sort of about people's names, I've have friends experience that where people just will not say their names, will ask to call them something else. Can I just call you X because it's easier? Okay, that's really painful. You know, as I said, that's somebody's name, that's somebody's heritage that you're taking away from them. I had in a Rotary experience. I was on a Rotary call in a district role, and somebody on the call, they'd seen, they'd heard my name, but they didn't know what I looked like. So I come onto a Zoom call and somebody says, oh, you know, the AG's here. And somebody actually said, because, you know, many people don't know how to put themselves on mute. That's one of the things we find in Zoom, isn't it? Somebody said, gosh, the AG's a Black woman. And I could hear the person having a conversation with their partner in the background, and they were quite surprised that the assistant governor was a Black woman. I just thought, gosh, you know, not again. I've had people not believe the position that I held, and actually, and I remember it quite well. I was introduced to somebody in a work setting, somebody who had actually worked in an organisation with for a number of years. And I was introduced as the head of governance and legal services. And the person looked at me and said, "Really?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Really?" "Yes. And you do that role?" And I said, "Yeah." And she asked it so many times that I actually had to ask her, "Is there a reason why you're so surprised that that's the job that I do?" And these things, and they might sound minor to people who don't experience them over and over again, but it's really exhausting. It's really painful. You know, every time somebody says, "Oh, can I touch your hair? Is your hair real?" In what context do people go around asking to touch people's hair? Actually, it happens to a lot of Black women, a lot of Black women. And these things, they're painful, they're exhausting, and they wear you down. And, you know, or you speak really well. Well, actually, what somebody's not saying that you speak really well. Somebody's saying you speak really well for a Black person. You speak really well for somebody who looks like this. You speak really well for somebody who comes from X country, for example. And they can, as I said, you know, it's painful, Brian, but also there is something about the microaggression that it's like somebody's trying to keep you in your place. It's like somebody's trying to really knock your self-confidence and make you often feel grateful for where you are. Oh, I should feel grateful that person thinks I speak well, etc. It's hard work. And I find that in the podcast that I did, when I talked about that, I think I said it's like lots of little paper cuts, you know. It hurts a little bit. If you get lots of paper cuts in one place, it's really painful.
It's interesting, you know, Dr. Sylvia Whitlock is on the call with us today.
I saw that.
And,
Hi, Dr. Sylvia.
And she actually wanted to know if you could comment on what it's like, not so much to be attacked, but really just to be ignored as a Black person in either the organization or throughout other things that you're doing.
Yeah, I can. I can actually, and that's one of the things that I find really difficult. And I'll give you an example. In a work setting, I have experienced saying something. I know how to use my voice, Brian, as you know. You know, and I have experienced many times saying something that is reasonable and rational and the sensible and right thing to do. I'm a lawyer and I give legal advice, so that's what I'm used to doing. And I have experienced not being heard, not being listened to, and then somebody else saying pretty much the exact same words that I've used, and that being a revelation. Wow, this is incredible that you said that. Okay, when that happens to you once, you know, 2 times, you kind of think, okay. When it happens over and over again, I think certainly for me, it's had either the effect of making me not want to speak up, because it's when you know that you're saying something that's right and you keep being ignored, actually it can make you just want to stop. And that's no good. Or it can make you want to use your voice even louder and be at risk of being called aggressive and being, as my friends and I would say, being angry Black woman, because that does happen, it happens often. But there really is something about not being heard that is really difficult, particularly when, as I say, you know you have something to say. You know, it shouldn't be, you know, she who shouts loudest. I really believe in fairness, and I believe in people having a voice and being listened to. But it happens over and over again, and actually it's very difficult. And I've actually, there comes a point, I think, where you decide, what is more painful? Is it more painful for me to carry on not being heard, to raise the fact that perhaps you're not being heard, and try to have discussion about that, or to let it go, because, you know, psychologically it's really tough.
Yeah, and it's interesting you brought that up, because somebody else was just asking if when that happens, do you speak up, or do you just like put your head down and keep working hard and hope that people notice what you're doing? And so you've kind of addressed that for them, so I won't go into that part. But
Yeah.
you know, as we move forward with the DEI task force, I think that, you know, ultimately that part of that goal is to make Rotary as diverse as we can and as inclusive as we can, you know.
Yes.
And I know that there's been I've heard from several clubs that there's been experiences where people will go and they go into a club and they just don't feel like they belong. And even though Rotary's open to everybody, if you don't really make people feel that they belong when they enter a room, that's not really being open to them, right?
No, it's not.
So my question though is that, like, how when you are as a district leader, a club leader, whatever your role, and you're trying to be more inclusive, how do you keep yourself from tokenizing people? You know, I've been tokenized often, and personally I kind of lean into it because I feel like it's important to really give voice to that. But how do you react to it when you're being tokenized, and what advice do you have for leaders to not do that, really?
Yeah, leading into tokenism is interesting. I remember once, Brian, in an organisation I worked in, they were suddenly asking me to be in all of these pictures for brochures and things. I was one of a very small number of people in the business who was black. In fact, I don't think there was anybody at my level who was not white. Okay, and I thought, is this a problem for me? Well, actually, no, this is not a problem for me, because I want people to see that I'm here. I'm happy to be a face of the organisation. So I understand that about, you know, leaning into it and being involved. But I think for district leaders or for others who are really serious about making our clubs and our districts and making Rotary more inclusive without being tokenistic, I think first of all, and it depends on your district, depends on your area and what the diversity is like, but there might be an acknowledgement at first that your district or your club is not diverse. Okay, so that, just be honest about where you are with that, and, you know, if there are only, you know, 25 people in your district who are not white, 25 people who are black, or Asian, or from another global majority background, then be honest about that. And I would also say, people come to Rotary because they've got so many different skills to bring to Rotary. So lean into people for the skill that they bring, lean into people for who they are as a whole, not just actually let's have a black person or an Indian person or a Latinx person involved in this. Lean into them for who they are, because when you do that, people feel appreciated. When people feel appreciated, you won't need to lean into them, because they'll want to get involved and want to show people that they're there for Rotary and with Rotary. But I think first of all, it starts with that acknowledgement about where the club is, where the district is. You know, I think that's really important.
You know, I last year at International Assembly, I was there with a Rotaract from my district who was a black woman, and we were having breakfast. My husband was there, and we had to start having this conversation around race. And my husband's like, "Well, how many black people are there in your district?" And so we started counting them, and suddenly we're just like, "Wait, you know, I mean, the fact that we were able to start counting black people in the district is problematic, right? Because honestly, there's a lot of black people in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Yeah.
You know, so it is something that we really have to do it. And I'm curious, you know, people are always coming to me after I speak, and they're like, "How do we get more gay people involved in our club?" And so I'm curious. I'm going to put that question to you. What is your advice for clubs? Because I have my own opinions on all this, but I want to hear from you.
So I think the first thing is, you know, you talked about being welcomed. Whoever you are, you want to be welcomed. Yeah. Brian, I talk about me being a reluctant Rotarian and why I did not want to join Rotary. So somebody asked me to join Rotary over and over again, and I was really adamant I was not going to join Rotary. And some of the things I say around that, and I'll be perfectly honest with you all. So I say, I'm not joining because Rotary is just lots of older white men playing golf, writing checks, and having, you know, lunches and dinners. What I was saying in that was not just that I believe Rotary was just white men playing golf, writing checks and having lunches and dinners. I was saying, and I don't believe that this is a space for me where I will be welcomed as a Black woman, as a working class Black woman. Okay. And how I came to Rotary was that somebody continually asked me, so ask people, ask diverse people. And they invited me to a wine tasting, okay? And I really like wine. So I went to the Rotary wine tasting, and when I got there, I saw a really diverse range of people there. There were Black people, there were Asian people, there were LGBTQ plus people, there were all kinds of different people there. That automatically made me feel welcome. The club didn't have to have 95% Black women for me to feel welcome there.
Right.
There just had to be, what I saw was a real commitment to diversity, to looking like the community, to wanting to be with the community, not sort of, you know, holding oneself up above the community and looking down, but really being there. I think that's really important, and I think that is something that will bring more. We're talking about Black people here, we're talking about, you know, Black people, Asian people, people from other global majority backgrounds. I think that is something that will bring people to Rotary when they see that there is a commitment to diversity. I think giving people a voice, you know, as we've talked about, is so important, because what can often happen, as we know, the same voices who always speak are always heard. So really bring people in, involve them, go out into the community, talk to groups and leaders who are working in organisations that might have a Black focus, a Black mental health charity, you know, a group for Asian men who are dealing with disabilities, whatever those different groups are. Actually go to the groups and show them who you are and ask them, what is it they're looking for? How can Rotary help? Don't just assume that Rotary, the Rotary Club, the district has an answer. Actually ask people, how can we help? What are the challenges and the things that your community are dealing with? How can we help with that? Can we come and help at your soup kitchen? When I was in London, there was a soup kitchen that was run by a Sikh group. You go and say, can we help? You know, that's how we bring people, is actually showing that we care about them and the community and the causes that are really important to different groups, in my opinion.
Well, and so we're getting a lot of questions about the task force. And so I just want to preface this before we say anything that Nadine and I are both here as independent people and not representing the task force directly. Because she's a lawyer, and so I'm just going to cover my butt.
Well done, Brian.
A lot of people are wanting to know, you know, what we're going to see come out of the task force, and I know, you know, as we're working on all of this, I know that it's an evolution, and we're having conversations, and it's really about, right now we're really looking at the current status of things, but what is your goal? What do you like? For me personally, when Valerie Wafer, who's our Rotary International Vice President nominee, or elect, sorry, asked me to be involved, she had this conversation with me, and she's like, you know, it's time to stop pulling people aside after they say something offensive or do something offensive and whispering to them and saying, hey, maybe you shouldn't do that. It's time to start addressing this head on and having a very honest, real conversation about what's going on in the world of Rotary, and as DEI applies to that. So I'm curious, what are your goals for the DEI task force, and what would you like to see come out of that?
Yeah, and I preface it by saying I'm so glad to be on the DEI task force. It makes me really happy to be able to be involved in this work with Rotary. And for me, there is something about honesty about where we are as an organisation as it relates to diversity, equity and inclusion. For me, what I would like to see come out of it is an honest about who we are and some of the experiences that people have within Rotary as it relates to diversity, equity and inclusion. And I think it's really about us saying, okay, we're not there yet, but this is what we're doing to take steps to do better, to be better, and so, you know, what's in my mind right now, Brian, is when I posted about, and it does relate to the DEI task force, when I posted about Rotarians against racism on Instagram back last year, somebody contacted me actually from your part of the world, actually, yeah. And she said to me, she said, gosh, I'm really surprised that Rotary would have anything to do with being anti-racist. Okay, not Rotarian. She knows other service organisations, and she'd had conversations with friends about some of their experiences, and so her impression of Rotary was that, you know, anti-racism wasn't something that Rotary would do or speak about, and I said, well, you know, actually, no organisation's perfect. And yeah, we've got work to do. We've got work to do in Rotary. But I think the organisation is starting to really acknowledge that we've got work to do. And so for me, it's that honesty. Where are we? Who do we want to be? Who do we want people to see us as? Because you know, I know that there are great Rotarians, of course there are, and I know that there are racist Rotarians. I've experienced them. Ultimately, what do we want people to say about us? What's the story that we want people to tell about Rotary? Actually, that it's a diverse organisation. Well, if we say that, if we say we're a diverse organisation, if that's within our mission, if that's who we are, then we actually need to be that on the tin. And if that's not where we are, then this is the work that we have to do to move towards that, to openly and honestly say, no, we're not diverse, or we're not inclusive, or whatever it is, or we are good at X, but we need to do more of Y. You know, and with us being a global organisation, of course, we could say, but we've got X number of Rotarians who are on the African continent, X number of Rotarians in Asia. That doesn't mean that we are where we need to be in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion. So yeah, for me, it's really about having that honesty and then being brave enough to speak the truth and look at how we can do better in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I feel really encouraged by the work, you know, that we're involved in already on the task force. I really do.
I mean, I agree 100%. And I think, you know, it's interesting what you pointed out though about, and I'm not finding my note on it, but I'm going to in just a second. But the global majority, you know, this is a term that you use to rather than talk about minorities. And I love this term because it's something, honestly, I'd never heard it before until today, and I'm in love with this term. But Rotary, really, the global majority is Rotary, and yet our leadership doesn't reflect that, right? So it's like, I mean, yes, Jennifer Jones is going to be the first female president of the organization. We've had one Black president in the history of the organization. Mm-hmm. You know, when we look at my district is a very progressive, forward-thinking, you know, open district, and we've had 3 people of color be governor in my district, and we have a lot of people of color in my district. So, You know, it's like there's growth that can happen all around. And that's what's encouraging to me as we go forward with this, is that we're starting to look at this and address this. But part of that is, as you say, we have to look at internally, we have to look at ourselves and where we're lacking and how we can expand that and do better and be better, really, to be best,
Absolutely.
as the former First Lady would say. And so I wanted to kind of have a conversation, because I know that you are a huge ally to the LGBTQ plus community, and especially with aging people in that community. And you know, I was approached by the LGBTQ or the LGBT fellowship about how do I diversify the fellowship, and you know, my suggestions are, well, what are you doing to support people in Uganda right now? What are you doing to address the issues of you know, 80% of trans women in the US, right, or that are murdered are Black. And so there really is this intersectionality that comes together with the work that we all do. You know, most of my work is focused internationally, and it's about class, and it's about interfaith dialogue and those kind of things, but they all factor into race. And so I'm curious, like, how does your work with both the LGBTQ plus community and other communities factor into the work that you do in your anti-racism work?
So for me, the anti-racism work is it's right in my heart, because it's part of, you know, to do with who I am. But when I'm thinking about the work that I do with the charity that I'm a trustee of, one of the key things that I think about is, where are the older Black, Asian, LGBTQ plus people? Because even in our charity, it's something that we talk about as trustees. There's not a lot of representation. So the question isn't just where are they, it's why are they not visible? Why might they choose not to be visible? What's the stigma attached in community? What's the stigma attached to faith? And we have to think about all of these things in the round. You know, we can't just say, actually, we want to help and work with older LGBTQ plus people, without thinking, you know, where is the gay Black man in this who's over 55? What's he doing during COVID? What are his support systems? How do we reach him? How do we find him? Particularly in communities where gay people have had to fight really hard to keep themselves in the closet because of how community might feel. So for me, all of the work that I do, yes, as I said, you know, racism is right here for me, but also so is working with, supporting people who are LGBTQ plus and LGBTQ plus and Black, LGBTQ plus and identifying as women. It all sort of comes together, and I think it's just really important. And as you asked that, I'm also remembering the conversation that I had with Valerie before joining the task force. You know, one of the things that we talked about was the fact that, yes, I'm talking a lot about Rotarians against racism at the moment, but actually that's not it for me. There is more than that. And it's really, for me, about just bringing everything together, because ultimately I care about communities. I care about marginalised communities. I believe in equity. I want people to live and have fairer and more equitable and just lives. I don't want people to just exist. I want them to be able to be who they are in all aspects of themselves, whether that's as a Rotarian, you know, whether that's as a gay man, you know, whether that's as a trans woman. I want people to be able to be who they are, and so for me, it's, you know, it all ties together. But yeah, I'm the head of the diversity committee in the charity, because, you know, it's something that I really care about. Just because we're an LGBT plus charity doesn't mean that we get things right in terms of diversity and inclusion.
Well, and I think it's the reason that they're all interconnected, right? It's like most my experience has been that most LGBTQ plus organizations tend to be white, cis
Right.
male driven.
Yeah.
And the homosexuality is not greatly accepted in many Black communities or Latinx communities, and so there is a sickle. And then we go to the concerns that you had about healthcare, right? I mean, it's like part of the reason that you may not have that is because older gay Black men were more greatly affected by HIV than white men. And so it's because they didn't have the healthcare available to them. And so I mean, there is a lot of, and that's why we have to look at this holistically, right? How do we approach all of this? I wanted to pivot to privilege, because it's like it's interesting to me. I'm gonna tell a little story. But my godson's mother is Black. She was born here in the U.S., but she lives in South Africa. And I was traveling to Cape Town a couple years ago, and she was like begging me to bring the butters for her, right? Because they don't sell the butters in South Africa. And for those of you that don't know, the butters are like they're organic oils and natural butter blends that are great for curly hair. It makes your hair healthier. And also, if you tend to overbleach your hair, they're also very good. And she's like, well, you can get them at any drugstore or at Target. And so I go to Walgreens and I'm like looking for the butters. And I'm in the hair care section and I'm going up and down the aisle and I'm not seeing this stuff anywhere. And so finally I go up to the counter and I'm like, where can I find this? And they take me to an aisle four aisles away from the hair care section where they have ethnic hair care. And that's where you buy that's where Black people buy products for their hair, frankly. And I was like floored because I never, I had no clue this was a thing. And so I was talking to her about this and she's like, yeah, and look at Band-Aids, Band-Aids, they say they're nude and they're the color of your skin. And so it's like, we have a society that's really built on being white. And while I think, especially, in Rotary, all of us have a level of privilege of some kind, right? Whether it's education or we were born into wealth or something. However, white privilege is a very real thing. And so I'm curious, how do you, how do you have that conversation with people about white privilege and getting them to recognize it, but then also to grow in some way from that?
Yeah, it's a really hard conversation for many white people to hear. Not all white people, but many to hear. And what I've often heard is white privilege doesn't exist because I'm white and my parents are poor and I haven't got a good job. I've got to work a number of jobs. Black people are doing better than me. It's a lot easier for you. Okay. People really do say that, and some people really do believe that. And there's something really about helping people to understand that, white privilege is about systemic privilege. It doesn't mean that you've not had a difficult life. And nobody's trying to take that away from you. This is not about something being taken away from you, but actually it really means that you are most likely not to have suffered additionally simply because you are Black, or simply because you are Asian, or simply because you are Latinx, for example, or an Indigenous person. And it can be really difficult, and it takes some real listening, and I think probably a willingness on people to want to grow in understanding. And also, many white people don't think white privilege exists because they've never had to think about their privilege or the benefits that they have in society by virtue of the fact that they're white. So, you've got somebody coming up to you and saying, well, actually, that's white privilege. It's really hard for people to hear, but it's important to have the conversation. It's important to take it away from the person and talk about the system. I think that really helps. People feel like they're being attacked. Often when you talk about white privilege, it's not about attacking. It's just about saying, actually, this is the truth. And I think I talked about this today in a podcast I was recording. We were talking about the four-way test and about, is it the truth? And I said, well, one person's truth, if we're talking about white privilege, may not actually be the whole truth, might just be the truth that they're used to. So if you've lived a life believing that Black people, and this is not me saying this, but if you've lived a life believing that, well, Black people don't do as well because they're lazy, people will say that, or why don't they get out of the ghetto? Why are they living like that? The theirs that people will say. They've had the same opportunities as me, we're no different, are the same. Actually, it's not true. And it can be a lifetime of unpacking that people have got to do around white privilege, but it exists, it's real. And saying that it exists is not an attack, it's just speaking the truth. And we've had some conversations around that in the Rotarians Against Racism community on Facebook. I remember particularly early on, there were some quite challenging conversations, but actually people were having the conversations, which is the important thing, is to have it, to discuss it.
So it's interesting because I don't share this story very often, but when I was growing up, my mom, was a single mom, raised 4 boys and made $18,000 a year, right? And so it was hard. And so I often hear this like, oh, well, I was poor and so I don't have this privilege. But the reality is I have never gone into a store and had people follow me around to see if I'm going to steal something. Or, and so it's not, and that's why I kind of bring it back to this. There's many types of privilege, right? Like there's people that are born into great wealth who are Black and they have levels of privilege. However, there was an issue with Oprah several years ago where, she was not allowed into Hermes because she was Black. And, so there's definitely, there's a lot to unpack with privilege. It was, the same friend, we were in Cape Town, I guess it was last year, and her car was broken into, parked in front of my house. And I had rented an Airbnb that was in like a wealthy white neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And she like, we talked to the guy who was the guy that lived next door, and he called the police, and the police were there and they were like taking a report down and this and that. And she was in shock. She's like, I have never seen that. And then she tells me the story that 4 years earlier, and this is, so her grandfather's Desmond Tutu, their last name's Tutu. 4 years earlier, their housekeeper, somebody had broken into their house and murdered their housekeeper. 4 days before the police came out to do anything. And that's an example of white privilege. Just because they lived in a different neighborhood that was not going to get the attention that people really wanted to, that the police were willing to give that to. And it's unacceptable, but it's something, it is a conversation we need to have. And I have felt very much that, I've been blessed in my life. I married for love, and that turned out really well. And I'm incredibly attractive. And so what we do is we try and use that privilege to really highlight these issues. How can we work together to really use the privilege that we have to make a difference? And so I'm curious for you, what type of privilege do you feel that you have, and how do you use that privilege to make a difference?
Yeah, I think, so if I think about, I come from a single parent household, I've not married for love yet, but I am also very attractive. I think about my privilege. So for me, there's certainly something about, my education, okay? And I know I'm very privileged. First generation in my family to go to university, first generation to go into the professions, yeah? That affords me some privilege. That means that in certain circumstances, I'm heard. People, you say that you're a lawyer, people really like that. I've never been overly impressed by it, okay, but I know that other people are, yeah. And I think for me, there's also something about, so I know how to use my voice. I'm not afraid to use my voice. And not everybody has that. Not everybody has that privilege, actually. And that's really important for me. I've worked in lots of leadership positions. You know, the privilege that you get with leadership is really vital, and we can do so much. And again, so you know, bring that back to Rotary. That's why I say we should use our privilege and our position as Rotarians to do better. We should use our privilege and our position, and I know that we do. You know, we do fight for justice. We do fight for and promote peace. Sometimes we try to do it in a really neat way, like, you know, let's help those people over there. Okay, so we're over here, let's help those people over there and show that we're really good people and we care about peace. We really do. But we need to use that same privilege to care about peace in our own backyards, you know, in our own communities, in our own neighborhood, on our own street. Because actually being a Rotarian is a privilege. Not, you know, we say there are 1.2 or so million of us, but you know, compared to world population, that's not a lot of people. So we're in a privileged position. It's really important that we use that.
So I agree 100%. And you know, Harry Eng, who is a member of the Rotary Club of Peninsula Starlight, which is here in the Bay Area, he points out that Rotary is often full of privileged people. And should we consider adding, you know, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion as one of Rotary's main focuses?
I love the idea of that. And yes, you know, Rotary is often full of privileged people. I think about that in terms of our, you know, our Rotary clubs and who we have in them and the roles that people have had in their non-Rotary lives outside of Rotary. But actually, Brian, it's also something I think about when I think about I was very lucky to work with a number of global scholars in clubs that I've been a member of, and so many of them come from really privileged backgrounds. Yeah. And that's, for me, that's still telling me that, you know, we're not doing enough. I really do like the idea of that being an area of focus.
Yeah, I'd actually never considered it either, but it's a really amazing idea, and we'll have some.
We should talk about that more.
Yeah, we should have Sylvia get on the call to people and say, hey, this should happen. Because we know she makes stuff happen.
That's really interesting.
So I'm curious, you know, with DEI, how do you feel that oh, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Do you feel that there, not just with DEI, but do you feel in regards to race, you can say globally in you know, the Western world, but do you feel that there's a change happening? Dr. Liz, who is another member, wants to know that, you know, she shares that her dearest friend is a Black man and they argue all the time because he says nothing's ever going to change. And her point is that it takes time, but that there are things that are changing in the world with Black Lives Matter being supported by people now of all races, you know, with the DEI task force, for example, in Rotary, and so many groups starting to work for that. Are you seeing a net positive change on things, or do you feel like it's just now starting to uncover and we're all seeing what the world is really like?
So I think at the moment the world is, you know, coming out of, you know, last year in particular, the world is really starting to see the truth of what happens in relation to racism, the truth of what it's like to be a Black man in America, you know, for example, as one example, okay. But I do believe, and I think, Brian, you know, I wouldn't be able to do the DEI work that I do if I didn't believe that there will be change. I don't think change will happen as quickly as I might like it to. And it's interesting, isn't it? You know, for some things we can change really quickly, but for others, it seems like a real slog. It takes forever. And I think we need to question why it takes forever for particular change. Where will the power balance shift? Who is at risk of losing power and privilege? Because when we look at change, that tends to be why things may happen more slowly. But I do think there is a shift. I think people are becoming more aware. I think people are wanting to do more. I think people are challenging more. I also think there's been an element of let's put out, this is not Rotary related, let me say that now, but I think there's been an element of, well, let's put out a statement and hire a head of diversity and inclusion somewhere, because that means that we're doing everything that we need to do, and that will come tumbling down, because that's not the answer actually. But the more systemic and sustainable change, I honestly believe that it's going to happen. I really do. Yeah.
I agree. And Nadine, I have to thank you so much for, I know it's super late for you now, and I'm so grateful for you for joining us tonight and being part of this continuation of the speaker series. Before I turn it back to Laura, I want to share that you might be aware, Nobel Peace Laureate Lema Bowie is a friend of the Rotary Club for Global Action, and we've been supporting her efforts to get youth educated in Liberia and throughout Western Africa since we chartered in October. And so as a token of our gratitude for your participation tonight, we made a donation of $150 in your name, which is going to provide book bags, school supplies, and uniforms for 5 girls in Liberia for the upcoming year. So thank you so much for everything and being part of this.
That's incredible, Brian. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. Thank you for listening. You know, I'm just really happy to be here and to keep having the conversations you said. So I really appreciate everybody's time.
Well, I'm so grateful, and I will talk to you more plenty online, I'm sure, and I'll see you next week. So back to you, President Laura. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for facilitating that powerful conversation. And thank you, Nadine, for taking the time to be with us this evening, for sharing your story, your heart, your mind, and for the important work that you're doing and bringing attention to how we can become more aware and educated and examining. May we all move forward with this on our minds and in our hearts and in our actions with every day and in our personal, professional, and Rotary worlds. I'm reminded that Rotary is a leadership organization, not just a service organization. And we can lead by example in our own circles of influence, proactively in our communities, and through our voice, our votes, our choices, our actions, and again, our voice to speak truth and to ask tough questions of ourselves and of others, and to listen. These are things that I've taken away this evening. Thank you all, every one of you, for your really engaged and attention and participation in the conversation this evening. The questions that Brian brought forward on our behalves and the conversations in the chat box have just been amazing this evening. So thank you all. And from the Rotary Clubs of Peninsula Starlight and the Rotary Club of Global Action, to you and to yours, thank you. We wish you a good evening. Be safe.